From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I think given the size of the fraud that took place and the fact that right now I think it sounds as if it was an accident and it's something that as a result could go by without anyone really knowing what happened, if no one speaks up, then it could happen again. So I think at this stage I have to do something.
The $9 billion witness. Meet J.P. Morgan Chase's worst nightmare. Today, in a Democracy Now! Broadcast exclusive, we speak with Elaine Fleischman, the whistleblower who helped the Justice Department force the bank to pay one of the largest fines in American history. You might be surprised what she says about the bank as well as the Obama White House. She's featured in a new Rolling Stone piece by recently returned Matt Taibbi.
The significance of this story to me is that it talks a lot about the legacy of Eric Holder. We finally have somebody from the inside who is telling us what a lot of us expected all along, that the Obama administration did have enough evidence to proceed against a lot of these guilty banks, and they just didn't do enough with that evidence and with those witnesses. And we finally have someone like Elaine Fleischman who can tell us all about that and all about what went on.
All that and more coming up. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're talking about the $9 billion witness. Meet the woman J.P. Morgan Chase paid one of the largest fines in American history to keep from talking.
Well, a year ago this month, the Justice Department announced the banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase would avoid criminal charges by agreeing to pay $13 billion to settle claims that it had routinely overstated the quality of mortgages it was selling to investors. When the toxic mortgage securities started turning bad, investors lost faith in the banking system, and a housing crisis turned into the 2008 financial crisis that led to millions of home foreclosures. New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman unveiled the settlement last November.
Not only will Chase have to pay the largest settlement ever levied against a financial institution, but it is admitted in our statement of facts that its own employees, employees of Bear Stearns, and employees of Washington Mutual made material misrepresentations to the investing public about a large number of residential mortgage-backed securities that they issued prior to the crash in 2008. This settlement is a major victory in the fight to hold accountable those who were responsible for that crash.
Soon after the J.P. Morgan Chase deal was reached, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder discussed the bank's misdeeds during an interview with NBC News' Pete Williams.
It packaged loans that it knew did not pass its own stated due diligence test. We have a whistleblower who indicated that she expressed concerns about what the strength of these mortgage-backed securities were, and they put them out there to the market and said that they were perfectly fine when, in fact, they were not.
So to be clear, you're saying that J.P. Morgan's conduct here contributed to the housing collapse?
Not only the conduct of J.P. Morgan, it was the conduct of other banks doing similar kinds of things that led directly to the collapse of our economy in 2008 and in 2009.
During that interview, Attorney General Eric Holder mentioned the role of an unnamed whistleblower from J.P. Morgan Chase, who aided the Justice Department's case against the bank. Well, until this week, that whistleblower, Elaine Fleischman, a securities lawyer who worked for J.P. Morgan, had never spoken publicly about what she witnessed inside the bank. That changed yesterday when Rolling Stone magazine published a major new piece by Matt Taibbi headlined "The $9 Billion Witness." Meet the woman J.P. Morgan Chase paid one of the largest fines in American history to keep from talking.
In the article, Elaine Fleischman criticizes not only J.P. Morgan's banking practices, but how government regulators at the Holder Justice Department responded to the bank's lawbreaking. Today, in her first televised interview, Elaine Fleischman joins us here on Democracy Now!, along with Matt Taibbi, who's closely covered the financial crisis for years. His latest book, Divide: American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap, has just come out in paperback. And we welcome you both to Democracy Now! For the hour.
Thanks for having us on.
So, Elaine Fleischman, start at the beginning. Why did you decide to come forward, and how did you end up at Chase?
Sure. For a long time, I was expecting it to come out. I've been talking to the government for 2.5 years now, and first it went through the SEC, Then it went through the civil division of the DOJ. And at some stage after watching all of these major banks have deals that actually the facts get wiped away, I started to feel that if I don't come forward, there's a real chance of that happening here too. In terms of JP Morgan Chase, I started there in March 2006 at sort of the height of the boom. When I started, everything seemed normal. I didn't really realize some of the things that were happening in the background. And then things started to change in about May, a couple months after I'd been there.
Well, when you went to work there, what specifically was your job? And if you could walk us through how you began to realize the huge problem that the bank was a part of.
Sure. I started as what they call a deal manager. Basically, we coordinate between all these different groups when we're bringing in these loans that are then going to be sold to investors. I first noticed that there was a problem when they brought in a new person to do our diligence, which is just the review of the loans themselves to make sure they're of good quality. As soon as he came in, this wall sort of came down between myself and the group that was doing this review, and you couldn't get information that you would normally get. On top of that, there was immediately sort of a no email policy. He wouldn't send emails, and we weren't allowed to send him emails. He would actually come out and yell at you if you sent him an email.
What was the reason?
It was never given, which was extremely worrisome because normally the reason why you have a compliance and diligence department is to actually have written policies about what you're doing to be able to explain to people how you're making your decisions. So it's exactly the opposite of what you would normally expect.
And when you say to review the quality of the loans, if you could,
Sure.
for people who are not aware,
Yes.
you were in essence certifying that these individual loans could be packaged into a group of securities to then be sold to investors in a huge package, right? But you had to go through every individual loan. Was that?
Yeah, that's pretty much what happens. It's really that you're taking the actual loan files that was done between the lender and the borrower and looking at them to make sure everything looks right. Does this person have enough money to pay off their loan? Do they have the sort of history where we think that they're going to pay this loan? And if we find that they don't, then we're actually not supposed to purchase the loans and certainly shouldn't be selling them to other investors without at least telling them there's something wrong with them.
And so what was the smoking gun for you?
Everything about what really started happening in particular became apparent in October was that sometimes we had deals coming in where even though I wasn't even the person looking at the loans, you could tell from where I was that something was wrong with them. The Greenpoint deal, which is what Matt talks about in his article, even when the loans came in, they were very, very old, which usually you try to actually pool these loans and sell them within 2 to 3 months. These loans were going back to close to the beginning of the year. If you work in the industry, you know immediately what that means is either they couldn't sell them because the buyers were telling them they weren't any good, or even worse, they'd been sold and then had missed a bunch of payments, so they'd actually been sold back to the originator. Any of those loans you wouldn't normally sell to investors as regular loans.
Now, Matt, you've referred in your article to these loans as basically selling old, beat-up used cars as if they were new. Could you explain that?
Yeah, that's exactly what Elaine is talking about. Essentially, what the bank was doing was there are companies out there, these mortgage lenders like. A company that might be familiar to people is like Countrywide. In this case, it was an originator called Greenpoint. They would go out into neighborhoods, and during this boom period, they were giving mortgages to anybody and everybody with a pulse, essentially. They were, especially low-income neighborhoods, they were offering these very advantageous loans to people, whether they could afford the houses or not. They were buying huge masses of these loans, and then they were
like liar's loans or stated income, where no one even checked whether the person had the income to actually pay it off.
That's exactly right. That was the verbiage, liar's loans. The FBI warned that there was going to be an epidemic of these liar's loans way back in 2004. The industry ignored these warnings. The government ignored these warnings. And there was this huge influx of these stated income loans where people could just say that they made an enormous amount of money and nobody would check. So the bank buys all these loans, and then what they were doing is essentially throwing them into big pools, making hamburger out of them, and then selling that hamburger to pension funds, insurance companies, hedge funds, all kinds of investors, typically ordinary people were the people on the other end buying this stuff. They were investing in these securities, and often they didn't even know it. What Elaine was involved with was making sure that these loans were of good quality, so that pension funds, when they bought these securities, weren't buying something that was going to blow up on them a year later. And what she found was that they were buying loans that were of very dubious quality, that were extremely risky, and that should not have been made into that hamburger.
Journalist Matt Taibbi and J.P. Morgan Chase whistleblower Elaine Fleischman. We interviewed them in November when Matt Taibbi's article, The $9 Billion Witness, came out in Rolling Stone. Stay tuned for part 2 of our interview.
Disappears somehow. I've got beer money, you've got champagne. If you don't stop spending, I'll go insane. I need money, give it to you, honey. Daddy, I need money now. Daddy, I need money now.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. In November, Juan and I interviewed J.P. Morgan Chase whistleblower Elaine Fleischman and reporter Matt Taibbi. His piece in Rolling Stone is headlined, The $9 Billion Witness. Meet the woman J.P. Morgan Chase paid one of the largest fines in American history to keep from talking. It was the first time Elaine Fleischman appeared on television. Attorney General Eric Holder appeared on NBC News just after the J.P. Morgan Chase settlement was reached over a year ago in November of 2013. He was questioned by NBC's Pete Williams.
But what about those who say, well, the message here is, if you do wrong, you just pay for it and move along?
This was not simply something that J.P. Morgan simply signed a check and smilingly said, this is a good deal for us. This inflicts pain on that institution.
Was this, in essence, a sort of template we can expect to see other settlements now?
I certainly think that the way in which this case has been settled is a template for what we can expect, both in terms of getting maximum amounts of money and then using that money so that we get it to people who suffer the greatest amount, that is either investors or homeowners.
That's Attorney General Eric Holder. Elaine Fleischman, let's take it back a step. When you started to alert your colleagues and your supervisors at J.P. Morgan Chase, what did they say?
Well, what happened is the transaction at one point just stopped. It turned out that 40% of the loans in this deal had problems with them. When we tried raising this issue with our superiors, what actually happened is they just started yelling at the diligence managers who were clearing the loans, sort of yelling, berating them, making them do reports over and over again. And it became clear that, although they wouldn't say it, it was going to be like that until they would clear the loans. So what actually happened is these loans started being cleared, but basically just by sort of the brute force of what was going on there. I raised it first with a managing director and an executive director and couldn't get any response. After that, I decided the best possibility would be to write a letter to another managing director that actually laid out everything I was seeing. I used the Greenpoint deal as an example, which is why the letter specifically says exactly who was doing what all over this deal. But it also lays out general problems in our diligence, that the sales people were being involved, which isn't normal, and that there seemed to be a lot of pressure on diligence managers to clear loans that shouldn't have been purchased or sold.
And the importance of putting it down in putting all the facts down in a letter, what that meant inside the company?
Yeah. Well, what it used to be is that the way that you could stop these things from happening was if you write a memo that lays out what's happening, the management won't go forward because they realize that if they do, there's going to be this evidence of what happened.
There's going to be a paper trail. Of
The big worry with these settlements and the way they're being done, and I'm not the only whistleblower in these cases, is that you have these emails and these memos, but nothing happens. A fine gets paid, and then all of the facts and who did what gets washed away. So as a whistleblower, you're thinking, I did all of this, and the DOJ has all of this, but for some reason they're not going forward on it.
So what happened when you went outside the company? How did you go outside?
Well, one issue I had is that although I warned not to securitize the loans, there was no way. I was blocked off, especially after I had raised complaints, from being able to see any of the data or the diligence process, which right there shows that something was wrong. So after I left JP Morgan, I actually had no idea for a full 4 years that the loans had been securitized. On one hand, I was worried they would, but I really thought no one would ever actually securitize those loans.
And this is an important distinction because Elaine had no idea that a crime had been committed until she had concrete knowledge that the loans had actually been resold to somebody else. They're certainly allowed to buy as many bad loans and as many risky mortgages as they want. It's not until they go to some investor and represent to them that these are, AAA rated securities or whatever, or highly rated securities, that they're actually committing fraud. And so she had no way of knowing that. Even after she was laid off from the company, she had no knowledge of what actually happened. So she couldn't actually report the crime yet because she only saw one half of the deal.
And you were laid off at the beginning of 2008, right? Yeah, actually before the crash. Already there was turmoil in the home loan market, but there was not the crash had not happened. So that the bank, when Jamie Dimon and other leaders later said that they had no realization that the market was tanking as fast as it could, at least your memos were certainly indicating to them that there were major problems in their portfolio.
Well, what's funny is they actually said two completely opposite things. There was an article in Fortune magazine later in 2008 in which they report that Jamie Dimon, the CEO of the company, knew as early as October of 2006 that the industry was rife with underwriting problems. All the things that Elaine is talking about, the company was aware of this. There are quotes in which the CEO is telling his subordinates, "We've got to get out of these investments because this whole thing can go up in smoke." And then meanwhile, so Chase is selling its own investments in these kinds of mortgages, but they're taking these same mortgages and selling them to investors and not telling them that they have these concerns. Later, when they testified in front of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission in 2010, Dimon said exactly the opposite. He said, essentially, we had no idea that these things were happening. We got caught up in the fact that housing prices were just going continually upward.
So talk about the settlement. What happened next?
Well, so the settlement happened in, I guess, a year ago about this month. And what's interesting about it is Elaine, by that point, had already talked to civil investigators in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Sacramento. And she talked to some very talented lawyers there who seemed very anxious to press this case. And they were about to release a very detailed civil complaint against Chase in September of last year. And just hours before that press conference, when they were going to announce that, reportedly, Jamie Dimon, again, the CEO of Chase, called up the Assistant Attorney General, asked to renegotiate, and they canceled the press conference, and they went back into negotiations. And a few months later, they had a settlement in which they paid a lot of money, but none of the facts came out. And
just like if you were in trouble, you could
I could
make that call.
Yeah, I could call up the mayor or the president and have the court case go away. That's exactly what happened in this case. Is they basically put in a phone call to the very top of the criminal justice system.
And what happened to your contacts with the Justice Department? If you could talk about that that process. How detailed did they want to get into the information that you had?
Well, my first contact, it was actually after 4 years. I was working in Calgary, and I got a call from the SEC.
Because you come from Canada.
Yeah. He introduced himself as an investigator from the Enforcement Division. And as I sort of paused for a minute, jokingly, he then said, "You weren't expecting to hear from me, were you?" And after that, they set up my first interview with the SEC, which was very short. It was only maybe an hour, hour and a half. They were only interested in one deal, and even though I kept bringing up Greenpoint and they had the letter that I had written, they weren't actually interested in that. And the SEC settlement was based on that other deal. And then it wasn't until later, about December 2012, that I first met with the DOJ investigators. And it was very clear that this was going to be very different. As soon as they walked in, you could tell they knew these securities up and down, and they were really anxious to go forward with it and felt very comfortable going forward with the case. So in that meeting, it was a very detailed meeting, sort of hours of going through how the process works and what happened. And then I had an actual deposition in about May of 2013, where they nailed down a lot more of that. And you could see at that stage, first I got to find out for the first time ever that how many of these loans had actually gone into, had been sold to investors in sort of one pool. And it was hundreds of millions of dollars worth of them with nothing actually disclosed about the problems with the loan. And then second, I got to really see what their case was, and they clearly realized they had an incredible case there.
Testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2013, Attorney General Eric Holder suggested some banks are too big to jail.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large. Again, I'm not talking about HSBC. This is just a more general comment. I think it has an inhibiting influence impact on our ability to bring resolutions that I think would be more appropriate.
Matt Taibbi, respond to what Attorney General Eric Holder testified.
Well, again, I mean, it's a crazy thing when the leading law enforcement official in the nation comes out and says, well, some companies are just so big that we can't prosecute them no matter what they do. In that case, he was testifying in the wake of a settlement the government had entered into with HSBC, which is the biggest bank in Europe and the biggest bank in Great Britain, which had admitted to laundering over $800 million for a pair of Central and South American drug cartels. And if you can't send someone to jail for laundering $800 million of drug money, because the company is too big, clearly something is very seriously wrong. But yet this became sort of the official policy of the Justice Department, and this greatly affected the way they dealt with companies like JP Chase, like Citigroup, like Bank of America. They tried to find a way to effect some kind of resolution that didn't involve criminal charges, didn't involve penalties to individuals, and also didn't put the facts of what they'd actually done out into the public.
Well, and in that vein, this is, it's the old Monopoly board game all over again. Get out of jail free. Instead of paying $200 to get out of jail, you pay $2 billion to get out of jail. But the amounts of money that these governments are getting as a result of this, I mean, I just checked with the New York State Comptroller. New York State alone this year is getting out of its bank settlements with Wall Street a windfall of $5 billion. That's just New York State. Other states are getting their share, and of course the federal government is getting huge infusions. And so they suddenly have all this cash. And then they also have this other stuff that you've talked about, which is consumer relief portions. So the governments actually get cash settlements, but then they supposedly negotiate additional money for the citizens, consumer relief. Could you talk about that?
Well, okay, there's a couple of things here. First of all, these settlements, they always come up with a big number, but the number is always actually, when you actually look at the accounting, it turns out to be smaller than they announce. In the case of the Chase settlement, the number they announced was $13 billion, but there's a couple of really important factors here. One is that $7 billion of that, $7 billion, right, was tax deductible, which means that all of us, American citizens, anybody who pays taxes, actually picked up the check for about $2.4 billion worth of the settlement. So we paid part of that settlement, which is crazy. I mean, the ordinary person, if we get a speeding ticket, we can't deduct that when we go to pay our taxes. But these people cratered the world economy, and they get to write a tax deduction for it. $4 billion of the settlement was what they call consumer relief. And what this really boils down to, I mean, there's some loan forgiveness where they're allowing people to pay less principal towards their home loans, but mostly it comes down to letting people have a little extra time to pay off their payments. And it's not always the bank that is actually doing that. It's often the investors in those loans who are actually giving the relief. So it's not really the bank paying $4 billion. It's just a number.
I want to turn to President Obama speaking in September when Attorney General Eric Holder announced that he would resign.
He's helped safeguard our markets from manipulation and consumers from financial fraud. Since 2009, the Justice Department has brought more than 60 cases against financial institutions and won some of the largest settlements in history for practices related to the financial crisis, recovering $85 billion. Much of it returned to ordinary Americans who were badly hurt.
Matt Taibbi, your response?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is, okay, they brought a bunch of settlements and they collected a bunch of money, but there isn't a single individual in this entire tableau who is actually individually paying any kind of penalty for any of these misdeeds. All of that money came out of the pockets of shareholders. No executives had to pay a fine. No executives had to do a single day in jail. There were not even charges filed against any individuals.
What was the actual crime you feel Jamie Dimon committed that you feel he should be in jail for?
I can't stand here and tell you that Jamie Dimon committed a crime, but certainly there are people in these companies and who in cases like Elaine's case who would be targets of criminal fraud prosecutions, and probably at a lower level than Jamie Dimon. I think it would be hard to prove, although who knows, because they didn't try. In a normal drug case, what you would do is you would take everybody who was guilty and you would try to roll them up the chain and see how far you could go. And that's exactly what they do not do in this case. They didn't aggressively go after everybody. They didn't follow every lead. Instead, they just sort of went into a back room, decided on a number, and made the whole thing go away. And yes, that is a kind of justice. It's a kind of resolution, but I think it's insufficient.
In fact, as you note in your article, after the settlement agreement with J.P. Morgan Chase, the stock of the company went up dramatically. The stock price of the company went up dramatically, and Jamie Dimon ended up getting a huge raise from his board of directors.
Yeah, in the first weeks after the settlement was announced, the market capitalization of J.P. Morgan Chase went up 6%, which translated into about $12 billion worth of value. So that's most of your settlement right there. Actually, it's almost more than the entire settlement if you look at it as a $9 billion settlement. And yes, Jamie Dimon, just a few weeks after being dinged for the largest regulatory fine in the history of capitalism, got a 74% raise by the board by the Chase board.
Well, earlier this year, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren criticized the size of Jamie Dimon's salary.
In 2013 alone, J.P. Morgan spent nearly $17 billion to settle claims with the federal government, claims relating to its sale of fraudulent mortgage-backed securities, its illegal foreclosure practices like robo-signing, its manipulation of energy markets in California and the Midwest, and its handling of the disastrous London whale trade. And at the end of the year, J.P. Morgan gave its CEO, Jamie Dimon, a 75% raise, bringing his total compensation to $20 million. Now, you might think that presiding over activities that resulted in $17 billion in payouts for illegal conduct would hurt your case for a fat pay bump. But according to the New York Times, members of the J.P. Morgan Board of Directors thought that Jamie Dimon earned the raise, in part, and I'm quoting here, by acting as chief negotiator as J.P. Morgan worked out a string of banner government settlements.
That was Senator Elizabeth Warren. I'd like Elaine Fleischman, the whistleblower within J.P. Morgan Chase, to respond. I mean, do you think part of what you exposed to the government earned Jamie Dimon this increase of 75%?
And I suppose the question is whether you're concerned about making money or whether there's criminal activity going on at the bank. There's actually an excellent website called jpmadoff.com with some lawyers who are involved in the Madoff case, where they've been tracking actually all of J.P. Morgan's fines for fraud and illegal activity, and they're actually at $29 billion now in the last 4 years alone. So the question that needs to be asked is, how is it that you can be a CEO over $29 billion worth of fines and get a raise? It also clearly shows that there's no deterrent to all of these fines. It's just happening over and over again. And if there aren't any individuals held accountable, there's no reason for any of them to actually stop doing these very serious crimes.
Well, and not only that, if all of those fines are continually occurring, where are the crimes that are the basis of being fined?
Well, yeah, and so that's one of the really important points too, is there's very little difference between civil securities fraud and criminal securities fraud, or even how you could do this as a wire fraud case. Once you have that strong of a civil fraud case, the only real difference is that you need a little more intent level. They had to have really intentionally been doing the fraud. And you have to prove it to a higher standard. It's, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that this is what they were doing. But when you look at these cases, these are some of the easiest white-collar crime cases that you're ever going to see. And one of the things that I think's been sold to the public is, well, these are really complex and difficult, or we don't really know who did what. First, in my case, and what I've seen in these other cases, there are all sorts of documents that show exactly who was making the decisions and who knew what. The idea that they're too complex, these securities themselves that are sold to investors are complex. But the fact that the investors were lied to about the quality of the loans, that's actually really easy. And the fact that obviously if you have people who can't afford their loans, there's going to be no money coming out of these loans is also something that's not a difficult thing to understand.
Elaine Fleischman, why didn't you go to the press back then, and what made you decide to do it now?
Yeah, I, for a long time, believed that this would come out, that the government would do their investigation and come forward with it. It's actually taken a really long time for me, because for me it's a little bit of an incredible thing to believe. But after watching all of these cases over and over again, at some stage I'm in the position where if I keep silent and the statute of limitation runs, or they do one of these agreements where they whitewash everything, then it's too late, which is what's happened over and over again so far. So I'm trying to change the pattern and come out first so that they have to either follow these properly the way they would for any other criminal defendant, or explain why they're not doing it.
And Matt Taibbi, the reality that despite all the claims of the Obama administration that they've pursued all these civil cases, that they never really went after the people who practically wrecked the world economy, and how that relates into this election result that we just had, where obviously Americans across the board, from Democrats to Republicans to independents, are still furious about their economic situation and the failure of holding these people accountable.
Yeah, I think it's hard not to make a connection between the total lack of enthusiasm that we saw for the Democratic Party this past week, and for instance, their behavior in pushing investigations of the financial services community, and we saw it with the Occupy protests. I talk to people on Wall Street all the time. I mean, all my sources come from Wall Street, and they all say the same thing, that Barack Obama had an incredible opportunity in late 2008, just after he took office, with his communication skills, he could have gone to the American people and explained to them exactly what happened and said, this is why the economy is bad, this is why you're losing your job, there was massive criminal activity, it's not just an accident, and then he could have gone and put a few people in jail and really put some teeth behind those words. Instead, they swept it all under the rug, and people, even if they don't completely understand what happened, they sense that nothing was done, and I think it's important to understand that.
I presume, Elaine Fleischman, that you had a confidentiality agreement when you left J.P. Morgan Chase. Are you violating that? What made you decide to take the risk?
Yeah, and there are different arguments about whether I am or am not violating it because of the criminal nature of what I'm saying, of what I'm bringing forward. For me, at some stage, it's just sometimes you're involved in something that's bigger than you personally. Even right now, there are still all sorts of suits out there by private investors, retirement funds, pension plans, trying to get their money back. And they don't, in a lot of cases, they don't know that I have information. So I actually now have in my email contacts coming in asking for help from me so that they can get this money that was really stolen from their investors, these retirees, back to those people. So for me, that's more important than anything that's going to happen to me.
Are you concerned about repercussions?
At some stage, I think I decided that this was more important, and at the end of the day, I'll be okay. I'll figure something out and I'll get through this, but I think we're at a stage where unless a lot of people start coming forward and say, we care about this, we now know what's happening, and we want someone to do something about it, that this is all just going to pass into history.
The government contacted you again this summer?
Yeah, in August they contacted me.
That call that they made. Yeah. And do you feel this can reopen this information, these cases?
I did meet with them, and I was happy to see that it was an enthusiastic group. The concern I have is that what we've seen is that even when there are really strong cases, you look at the J.P. Morgan Madoff case, HSBC, they still, no matter how strong it is, they just get hushed away. So
and that's an important distinction, too, is that it's often not the line investigators who are the problem. The people who actually work these cases, the career prosecutors who are doing this digging, oftentimes they're very talented and aggressive lawyers who really know what they're doing. The problem is the political wing of the Justice Department can take those cases and do whatever they want with them. And we saw in Elaine's case and in many other cases that they take these excellent investigations and then they just turn them into these slap-in-the-wrist settlements, and that's what she's worried about, I think.
I just wanted to close by asking you about how you would judge the tenure of Eric Holder, and now obviously that he's going to be leaving, in terms of his particular role in going after these banks, and just this whole idea of bankers being able to call directly to the Justice Department to negotiate their deals and stop prosecutions at the lower levels.
Well, you know, it's funny, for years now, I've been covering a lot of this stuff, and I've spoken to a lot of people in law enforcement, and there are really two types of people that I talk to who are prosecutors. One is the kind of old school law enforcement type. They want to get the bad guy at all costs, and they're really career civil servants who just want to do their jobs and want to see justice happen. And then there's this new kind of person who's appearing in government now who comes out of the corporate defense sector. These are people who grew up as corporate lawyers defending companies like Chase and Bank of America, and that's who Eric Holder is, very pointedly. He spent a long time at a company called Covington & Burling, and this type of lawyer, this type of law enforcement official is much more interested in coming up with a settlement that everybody feels good about when they walk out of the room, as opposed to the old school kind of justice where the bad guy gets his or her comeuppance in the end. And I think his tenure was very representative of a big sea change in the way we do white-collar crime in this country.
That was Rolling Stone reporter Matt Taibbi and J.P. Morgan Chase whistleblower Elaine Fleischman. She's featured in Matt Taibbi's article, The $9 Billion Witness. They appeared on Democracy Now! In November. It was Elaine Fleischman's first ever television interview. When we come back, we speak with Matt Taibbi about his book, The Divide, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In April, journalist Matt Taibbi joined us on Democracy Now! To talk about his new book, The Divide: American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap. The book asks why the vast majority of white-collar criminals have avoided prison since the financial crisis began, while an unequal justice system imprisons the poor and people of color on a mass scale. I interviewed Matt Taibbi with Democracy Now!'s Aaron Mate, and I began by asking Matt to talk about this divide.
This book grew out of my experience covering Wall Street. I've obviously been doing it since the crash in 2008, and over again, I would cover these very complex and often very socially destructive capers committed by white-collar criminals. And the punchline to all of the stories were basically the same. Nobody would get indicted, nobody went to jail, and after a while I started to become interested specifically in that phenomenon. Why was there no enforcement of any of this? And around the time of the Occupy protests, I decided to write this book, and then I shifted my focus to try to learn a lot more for myself about who does go to jail in this country, because I thought you really can't make this comparison accurately until you learn about both sides of the equation, because it's actually much more grotesque to consider the non-enforcement of white-collar criminals when you do consider how incredibly aggressive law enforcement is with regard to everybody else.
Now, you spent time with the poor and vulnerable and people of color who've been targeted by this system. There was one case of a man in New York who lives in Bed-Stuy, standing outside of his home, who was arrested. Can you take it from there?
Yeah, sure. I was actually in a law office in Brooklyn, and I was actually waiting to speak to a lawyer about another case when I met this 35-year-old African-American man, a bus driver, and I asked him what he was there for, and he told me that he had been arrested for quote-unquote obstructing pedestrian traffic. And I thought he was kidding. I didn't know what that meant, and I asked him to show me his summons, and he pulled out a little piece of pink paper, and there it was. It was written, obstructing pedestrian traffic, which it turns out it meant that he was standing in front of his own house at 1 o'clock in the morning, and the police just didn't like the way he looked and arrested him. And this is part of the disorderly conduct statute here in New York, but this is one of these offenses that people get roped in for. It's part of what a city councilman in another city called an epidemic of false arrest. Basically, these new stats-based police strategies, the whole idea is to rope in as many people as you can, see how many of them have guns or warrants, and then basically throw back the innocent ones. But the problem is they don't throw back everybody. They end up swooping up a lot of innocent people and charging them with really pointless crimes.
There's a very comic scene where then he goes to court and he has a hard time convincing his public defender why he doesn't want to pay a fine for standing in front of his home.
Yeah, and this is something that I encountered over and over and over again, is that people who are charged with these minor sort of harassing offenses, when the state discovers that the case against them is not very good, they start offering deals to the accused. And when people protest that I'm not going to plead because I didn't do anything wrong, they keep offering better and better and better deals, and no one can understand why they won't plead guilty, because in reality most people do. They will end up taking
like all the bankers plead guilty.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Of course, it's completely the opposite situation and the other side of the coin. But in the case of Andrew, the guy who was arrested for obstructing pedestrian traffic, he literally could not convince his own lawyer that he was innocent, and it took a long time before they got the judge to ask the policeman on duty if there was actually anybody else on the street to obstruct, and it wasn't until that moment that they dismissed the case, and it just took that long.
So let's talk about the other side, and I want to go to Attorney General Eric Holder. His remarks before the Senate Judiciary Committee last May, in which he suggests that some banks are just too big to jail.
I am concerned that the size of some of these institutions becomes so large that it does become difficult for us to prosecute them when we are hit with indications that if you do prosecute, if you do bring a criminal charge, it will have a negative impact on the national economy, perhaps even the world economy. And I think that is a function of the fact that some of these institutions have become too large. Again, I'm not talking about HSBC. This is just a more general comment. I think it has an inhibiting influence, impact on our ability to bring resolutions that I think would be more appropriate.
That was Attorney General Eric Holder testifying before Congress. His remarks were widely criticized. This is federal Judge Jed Rakoff speaking last November at the University of Pennsylvania Law School.
To a federal judge who takes an oath to apply the law equally to rich and poor, this excuse, sometimes labeled the too big to jail excuse, is frankly disturbing for what it says about the department's apparent disregard for equality under the law.
That's federal Judge Jed Rakoff. Matt Taibbi, if you could respond, and then talk about the history of Eric Holder, where he came from.
Well, first of all, this idea that some companies are too big to jail, it makes some sense in the abstract. In a vacuum, of course it makes sense. If you have a company, a storied company that may have existed for 100, 150 years that employs tens or maybe even 100,000 people, you may not want to criminally charge that company willy-nilly and wreck the company and cause lots of people to lose their jobs. But there are two problems with that line of thinking if you use it over and over and over again. One is that there's no reason you can't proceed against individuals in those companies. It's understandable to maybe not charge the company, but in the case of a company like HSBC, which admitted to laundering $850 million for a pair of Central and South American drug cartels, somebody has to go to jail in that case. If you're going to put people in jail for having a joint in their pocket or for slinging dime bags on the corner in a city street, you cannot let people who laundered $800 million for the worst drug offenders in the world walk.
Wait, this can't be a parenthetical. Explain what you're talking about with HSBC.
So HSBC, again, this is one of the world's largest banks. It's Europe's largest bank, and a few years ago they got caught, swept up for a variety of offenses, money laundering offenses, but one of them involved admitting that they had laundered $850 million for two drug cartels, one in Mexico and one in South America, including the notorious Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico that is suspected in thousands of murders. And in that case, they paid a fine. They paid a $1.9 billion fine. And some of the executives had to defer their bonuses for a period of 5 years. Not give them up, defer them. But there were no individual consequences for any of the executives. Nobody had to pull money out of their own pockets for permanently. And nobody did a single day in jail in that case. And that, to me, was an incredibly striking case. I ran that very day to the courthouse here in New York, and I asked around to the public defenders, what's the dumbest drug case you had today? And I found somebody who had been thrown in Rikers for 47 days for having a joint in his pocket. Is
that even illegal?
No, in New York City, actually, it's not illegal to carry a joint around in your pocket. It was decriminalized way back in the late 70s, but part of the now past stop and frisk, what they do is they would stop you and then they would search you and force you to empty your pockets. When you empty your pockets, now it's no longer concealed, and now it's illegal again. So they had, in that year, they had 50,000 marijuana arrests, even though having marijuana was technically decriminalized at the time. So my point was, here's somebody at the bottom. He's a consumer of the illegal narcotics business, and he's going to jail. And then you have these people who are at the very top of the illegal narcotics business, and they're getting a complete walk, and that's just totally unacceptable.
But back to this doctrine that you can't punish an entire company for the misdeeds of a few because you might hurt the economy, you might hurt shareholders, some of which are pension holders and pension funds and so forth. How do you get from hurting a company? How do you equate hurting an entire company to just not jailing a couple of executives?
Well, that's the whole point. They've conflated the two things. Originally, so this to answer the second part of your original question, where does this come from? Where does this doctrine come from? Way back in 1999, when Eric Holder was a deputy attorney general in Clinton's administration, he wrote a memo that has now come to be known as the Holder Memo, and in it he outlined a number of things. Actually, it was originally considered a get tough on corporate crime memo because it gave prosecutors a number of new tools with which they could go after corporate criminals. But at the bottom of it, there was this thing that he laid out called the collateral consequences doctrine. And what collateral consequences meant was that if you're a prosecutor and you're targeting one of these big corporate offenders, and you're worried that you may affect innocent victims, that shareholders or innocent executives may lose their jobs, you may consider other alternatives, other remedies besides criminal prosecutions. In other words, fines, non-prosecution agreements, deferred prosecution agreements. And again, at the time, it was a completely sensible thing to lay out. Of course, it makes sense to not always destroy a company if you can avoid it. But what they've done is they've conflated that sometimes sensible policy with a policy of not going after any individuals for any crimes, and that's just totally unacceptable.
Is it not the case that some of these cases are just too complex to explain to a jury?
Yes, and well, they are complex, and juries do have a difficult time with them, but they're not impossible to explain to a jury. I mean, I attended a trial involving bid rigging in the municipal bond markets where they obtained convictions. Now, that case couldn't have been more complicated. That was as hard as a case gets. And I actually watched some of the jurors fighting off sleep in the early days of the trial. That's how difficult it was. And in that case, amusingly, one of the attorneys for the banks got up initially, and he tried to defend his client's behavior by saying, you know, when you call up if your washing machine breaks and you call the repairman and he tells you how much it costs, you just have to trust him what the price is, because you don't understand how to fix your washing machine, and we do. In other words, this stuff is so complex, you just have to take our word for it that we didn't commit a crime. But that excuse, I think that's a weak excuse that prosecutors give out. It's a cop-out for not taking on difficult cases. Rich or poor, black or white. If somebody has broken the law, you should want to go after wrongdoers, no matter who they are. And the fact that it's a difficult crime to prove should just be more of a challenge for you.
I want to turn to remarks by Lanny Breuer in 2012 about prosecuting large companies. At the time, he was the Assistant Attorney General. He spoke before the New York City Bar Association.
And now it's my duty to consider whether individual employees with no responsibility for or knowledge of misconduct committed by others in the same company are going to lose their livelihood if we indict the corporation. In large multinational companies, the jobs of tens of thousands of employees can literally be at stake. And in some cases, the health of an industry or the markets are a very real factor. Those are the kinds of considerations in white-collar cases that literally keep me up at night, and which must play a role in responsible enforcement.
That's Lanny Breuer in 2012, who was like #2 in the Justice Department.
He was the head of the criminal division, so he's basically the top cop in America at the time.
He was at the Justice Department. Of course, Eric Holder is the Attorney General, both from the same company. Respond to what he said, and then talk about Covington and Burling.
First of all, that whole thing about the innocent white-collar employees perhaps losing their livelihoods, keeping him up at night. I want to know what his response is to, the idea that maybe a single mother on welfare is going to lose her kids because she's going to lose custody in an $800 welfare fraud case. I saw so many of these cases that it was just overwhelming to me. Those are the kinds of things that would keep me up at night if I were the Attorney General, thinking about the consequences that ordinary people suffer when they are caught up in the criminal justice system. For instance, again, going back to welfare fraud, your relatives can lose their Section 8 housing. So if you're on welfare and you get caught in a fraud case that may just involve checking the wrong box or having one of your neighbors say that you have a boyfriend living in your house when you really don't. Your mother or your grandmother can lose their housing because of something like that. That would be the stuff that would keep me up at night. I mean, I wouldn't be worried about millionaire and billionaire executives who are working at these banks if I were Lanny Breuer. So that tells you a lot about the priorities of somebody like him.
And talk about Lonnie Brewer, Eric Holder, where they come from, where they go back to.
So they both came from a law firm called Covington & Burling, which in the 2000s represented basically every single one of the too big to fail banks. They were also involved in the setting up of the electronic mortgage registry, so they played an enormous role in the subprime mortgage crisis. But here's the key thing about the presence of these two people and at the head of the Justice Department. Prosecutors, by and large, and I interviewed a lot of prosecutors for this book, they basically all have the same personality, the old school prosecutors. They're just, if you think of somebody like Elliot Spitzer, they're all like bulldogs. They just want to get their target by hook or crook. It doesn't really matter. They have this ferocious aspect to their personalities, and it's an admirable quality in a prosecutor. They're all kind of the same in a certain way. Cops are the same way. But in the 2000s, that kind of person started to be replaced in the regulatory system by a new kind of figure who tended to come from the corporate defense community. And their attitude was not, get their target at all costs. It was more, let's bring a bunch of people in a room and hammer out a solution where all the sides are going to end up walking out happy. And that's why we end up with settlements like the $13 billion Chase settlement last year or the $1.9 billion HSBC settlement instead of prosecutions.
Covington & Burling represented J.P. Morgan Chase.
They did, yeah, and a host of other banks that also were involved in non-prosecutions during this time. So, I mean, you have a whole bunch of people who are sort of at the top of the regulatory agencies, whether it's Justice, the SEC, the CFTC, maybe the Enforcement Division of the SEC, who all came from these big banks or from law firms that represented these big banks. And it's a very incestuous community, and just like you talked about with James Kidney, the SEC official who left, as a result of this kind of merry-go-round of people who all work for the same companies, and they're going to go to government for a while, and then they're going to go back to the corporate defense community after they leave and make millions of dollars. They're very, very reluctant to be aggressive against these companies because culturally they're the same people as their targets, whereas there isn't that same simpatico with the very poor. And I think it's an important distinction to make, and people don't understand it.
You also suggest that Holder and Brewer are perhaps overly concerned with their conviction rate, and that's why they're not go after these banks.
Again, that's something I heard over and over again from people within the Justice Department, that once those two came in, the edict came down from above that we were only going to go after cases where we were absolutely sure we were going to win. Now, and you can never guarantee a victory in any criminal case, and oftentimes the cases are difficult to prove, or the evidence may not be 100% there, but the state has a moral obligation to proceed with investigations, and in many cases, criminal cases, against people who are guilty. The fact that it's difficult shouldn't be a limiting factor. And that's why you saw, instead of cases against these big banks, you saw ridiculously large amounts of resources devoted to things like prosecuting Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens, cases where there were like only a couple of pieces of evidence and it was hard to screw up. And yet, they didn't know we would succeed even in those cases. So it was a terrible, terrible thing for the Justice Department during that period.
Matt Taibbi, author of The Divide, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap. To watch the full interview, visit democracynow.org. And that does it for today's show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Aaron Mate, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alkoff, Hani Massoud, Robbie Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield, Anna Osbeck, Sam Riddell, Mike DeFilippo, and Miguel Noguera, our engineers. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley, Hugh Grand, Jessica Lee, David Pruden, Vesta Godars, and to our camera crew, John Randolph, Karen Krug Meadows, Carla DeJesus. Happy New Year. I'm Amy Goodman.